Hey everyone, this is Rosie, and today we're going to be sewing a fabric basket with a round bottom. So let's get started. So the first thing that you need to do is decide how large you want your basket to be. So I want the bottom of the basket to be a finished size of 6 inches. That's a 6-inch circle, which means that it has a 6-inch diameter. And to that I need to add some seam allowances. And I'm using 1/2 inch seam allowances for this project. So I multiply 2 times 1/2 inch, and that gives me 1 inch. And then I'll add that 1 inch to my 6-inch circle. That means that I need to cut out my circle 7 inches, or a circle with a 7-inch diameter. Then the next thing that you need to do is calculate the length of the sides of the basket. So to do that, we're going to take the same 6-inch finished size of our circle, and we're going to multiply that 6 inches by the value of pi. Now, pi equals 3.14159. And I'm going to multiply that number, the value of pi, times my 6 inches. And that gives me a value of 18.850 inches. Then again, I need to add in my seam allowances, and I'm using the 1/2 inch seam allowances. So again, 2 times 0.50, or 1/2 inch, and that gives me 1 inch. And then I add that 1 inch to the value of the diameter of the circle times pi, which is the 18.85, and I come up with 19.85 inches. Now, it's not easy to measure 19.85 inches on a ruler, so what I do is I round that number to the nearest 1/8 of an inch. So I look at this number right here, the 19.850, and I have a chart right over here which shows what 1/8 of an inch is as both decimals and fractions. So I'm going to see where my 0.850 inches falls on this chart as a decimal, and it falls between 0.750 and 0.875. But it's closer to the 0.875 than it is to the 0.750. So I am going to round that 0.850 up to 0.875, or 7/8 of an inch. So the length that I'm going to cut my sides at is 19 7/8 inches. Now, that's just for the length of the sides. You have to decide how tall you want your fabric basket to be. And I'm going to make a basket where I'm folding over a cuff. So I'm going to cut it 9 inches high. So the length that I'm cutting for this project will be 19.78 inches long by 9 inches high. So if you like, you can take a screenshot of this chart, and when you make a future project, you can use these same calculations to determine the size of the circle that you need to cut and the length of the sides that you would need to cut. Now you're going to need a template to cut out your circle. So what I did here is I went onto my iPad and I used the Pages app on the iPad to draw a circle. You can just insert a circle into the Pages app on your blank page. You can size it to the correct size and then print it. Now, when you print it, you have to make sure that your printer is set to 100%, or actual size. And then once it's off of the printer, you just want to measure across the middle to make sure that the diameter that you need is correct. Now, if you don't have access to software where you can create a circle template for yourself, you can go on the internet and just Google printable 6-inch circle, or whatever size circle that you want, and you'll come up with a lot of options for printing out your circle. And again, just make sure that when you print out the template that your printer is set to print at 100%. Now, another alternative for cutting out your circles is to use an electronic die cutting machine. If you have one that is not able to cut out fabric, then you can just go ahead and print out a paper circle on your die cutting machine. If you have a machine such as the Cricut Maker that will cut out fabric, you don't even have to cut out a paper template. You can just set your machine to cut your circle for you right onto your fabric. I am using 100% quilting cotton fabric for the project. So you'll need to cut out 2 circles. One circle will be for the exterior of the bag, and the other one will be for the interior of the bag. And each circle is 7 inches in diameter. I did use my Cricut Maker to cut out my circles, and each circle has been fused with some woven interfacing. And in addition to cutting out the fabric circles, I also cut out some fusible fleece, and the fusible fleece is a 6-inch diameter circle. And then I will just center that fusible fleece right over my fabric circle and fuse it down with my iron. Now, if you're worried that it's not perfectly centered, then you can just take a ruler and measure around in a few places and just make sure that you have a 1/2 inch between the edge of the fleece and the edge of the circle. But what you can also do if you're cutting it out with your Cricut Maker is set the circle in Cricut Design Space to cut out at a 7-inch diameter, and then you can draw a circle with a 6-inch diameter, and that will be your placement guide for putting down your fusible fleece. Then for my sides, I cut the length of 19 7/8 inches, and I cut it 9 inches high. And the reason why I made it so tall is because I want to be able to fold it down and make a cuff. And the 9 inches gives me enough to do a nice cuff. And both my exterior and my interior pieces have been fused with the same woven interfacing. And then I cut out a piece of fleece that was a 1/2 inch shorter on each side. So instead of cutting this 19 7/8, I cut it 18 7/8, and instead of being 9 inches high, it's only 8 inches high. And the reason why I always do this is because I don't like the bulk in my seam allowances. And I'm going to show you how I set this up to fuse down the fleece. Now this piece right here will be for my interior. And as I said, I want to fold down a cuff. So if this is on the inside of the basket, it would be positioned this way. If I fold my cuff down this way, my dogs will be upside down. So if you're using a directional fabric, you do need to be mindful of this if you want to create a cuff. So that means that my cuff needs to be folded down from this side, and that also means that my circle has to be sewn into this side right here. So I'm just going to put a little X there so that I know that that's where my circle is going to be sewn into. Now the first thing that I want to do before I fuse on the fleece is I want to turn under a seam allowance here. So I'm just going to mark 1/2 inch away from the edge. I am using a friction pen here, and I'm only doing it for demonstration purposes, because with the friction pen, while the ink will disappear with heat, it can come back with cold. So I'm very careful about where I use my friction pen. Normally I would only use it out in the seam allowances or in a place that's never going to be seen. So what I want to do now is I want to go over to the iron and I want to fold this down and press it down. Now that I have the seam allowance pressed down, I'm just going to take my ruler and I want to mark in 1/2 inch on each side of the panel. And then I'll take my fleece and I want to butt it right up to where that seam has been folded and pressed down. So I'm going to butt it right up to there, and I want the edges to stay within the marks that I just made. Okay, I'm probably going to trim this down just a tiny bit so that it's within those 1/2 inch marks. And then once I have it placed, I'm going to go over to my iron and I'm going to fuse the fleece down. And that's going to keep the fleece out of my seam allowances. I have the fleece fused down, and the next thing that we want to do is sew our side seams together. As far as the interfacings go, you certainly can experiment around with that. If you don't want to use fleece, you can try using some flex foam, some of the Pellon flex foam. If you do, I would only put the flex foam on one side. Now, when you pin your or clip your seams together, your side seams together, you want to unfold where you press that seam allowance down, and you're going to sew all the way to the end. You'll be sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and when you clip, you want to make sure that your side edges are together, but you also want to make sure that your top and your bottom edges are together. I'm going to sew my seam allowance at a 1/2 inch with a stitch length of 2.5. And if anyone is interested, I am sewing on a Juki TL 2010Q. And you do want to backstitch at both ends. And this end has the seam allowance that was pressed down. You just want to sew that while it's completely open. You don't want it to be folded down. And now you'll go and do the same thing to the other panel. I have the side seam sewn on both the exterior and the interior pieces, and I pressed open the seam allowances on both. Now we're going to set in the circle. So to do that, we're first going to make some quarter marks in both our sides and our circle. So what you'll do is you'll fold this right where your seam is and stretch it out. And this will be 1/4 mark right here. Just take your scissors and make a little clip. Now, if you're not comfortable making a clip in here, then you certainly can mark it with some marking tool that you might have. And then you want to take where you just clipped and then line that up with your seam right there. Okay, and again, you're going to pull out to each side and then make another small clip. You certainly don't want to go past your seam allowance with that clip. Okay, and you'll do that to both sides. And then you're going to take one of your circles and do the same thing. So here's the circle. We're going to fold it in half. Okay. And then you're going to clip on each end, another tiny clip. And then you're going to take the 2 clip marks that you just made, you'll bring them together. Make sure that your circle is folded completely in half again with all of the edges matching. And then you're going to clip again. So now we're ready to set the circle into the sides. So first we're going to match up these notches. And you'll match up all of the quarter marks. Then once you have them in place, all the quarter marks in place, you're going to sort of push this down and make sure that all of the edges are even. The edge of your circle needs to be even with the edge of the exterior side. And it's just going to fit right in there. You can see it's how nicely it's just easing in. So it's important to keep those edges together. Now, if you're not comfortable with clips, you certainly can use pins. Use whatever you're comfortable with. And you want to try not to have any puckers in that seam allowance there. So that's all fitting in there very nicely with no puckers. Then you'll go to the second quarter and do the same thing. Just bring the edges up towards each other and then you'll start clipping. And as long as you've cut accurately and you keep these edges together, the edge of the circle and the edge of the side, it should just go right in there very easily. So go ahead and finish clipping each quarter in the way that we're doing right now. So here's what it should look like when everything is either pinned or clipped into place. And don't be afraid to use as many pins or as clips as you need. Now, when you sew this, we're going to sew from the circle side, and you're going to put it down onto the bed of the machine, and you'll start to sew. And then as you have to pivot around, you want to make sure that this side panel doesn't get skewed. You always want to stop, straighten it out, feel underneath to make sure that you're not getting any puckers. The place where you'll probably get puckers, if you do, will be on the side, not on the circle. And if you do get a pucker, no big deal. You can take out that little section and re-sew it. When you get a pucker, it's usually because the fabric on the sides is getting a little bit twisted and getting caught under the needle. But as long as you go slow and you make sure that you're feeling whether or not there are any puckers there, you'll be fine. And you can feel if you're starting to get a pucker. If you feel that you are, then you're just going to readjust here, and you can always reach your hand inside and smooth things out as well. Now I'll start sewing the circle. I am sewing from the circle side, and I'm sewing with this stitch length of 2.5. And right now everything is nice and flat. I don't have any puckers under there. You can backstitch here a little bit if you like, and you're going to go slow. The secret of this is going slow and readjusting. And every time I take out a clip, I make sure that everything is flat. I can feel it with my finger. There are no puckers under there. I'm just going to readjust. I can always put my hand inside to make sure it's flat, and I can feel with my fingers to make sure it's flat. So now I took out a clip. I'm just going to reposition a little bit. Make sure your edges are staying even. And feel for puckers, and then sew. Okay, everything's flat. You want to make sure that your edges are even. If they go off slightly, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's more important that you do not get any puckers in your side there. Once you've put in a few of these, it really becomes a lot easier. I'm almost back to where I started. Okay, now back to the beginning. I'll do a little bit of back stitch, and what I'll do next is I'll turn it right side out to make sure that I don't have any puckers. So I just checked and everything is laying in there very nicely. There are no puckers. So the next thing that I want to do is turn the wrong side out, and I want to trim this seam allowance. And I'm going to trim it down to somewhere between 1/4 of an eighth of an inch all the way around. And then when you're done with that, you just want to go and sew the interior the same exact way that you just sewed this. So now we have both the exterior and the interior sewn together with the bottom in place, and now we're going to put them together. So I want to have my exterior with the right side out, and I want to have my interior with the wrong side out. And then I'm just going to take the interior and place it inside the exterior part of the bag. Just push it down in there. And then I want my side seams to match. So I'm going to take the side seam from the interior and I'm going to match it up with the side seam of the exterior. My edges are folded down and I'm going to clip them together. And you want them to be even with each other. So we're just going to clip all around the top edge. And then when we're done clipping this together, we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to do a top stitching right along this top edge. Now I'm going to do the top stitching, and I will sew with a 3.0 stitch length. I want to start right at the side seam there, and I am going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from this folded edge. So on my sewing machine, the middle of this toe is about 1/8 of an inch away from the needle. So I will just use the middle of the toe as a guide. I'll just guide it right along this edge here. I'll back stitch a little bit right there. And I'm just going to sew all around the top edge. Make sure that those folded edges are staying even as you sew around. If you have a free arm sewing machine, now's a good time to use it. And backstitch again when you get to the beginning where you started. So now my interior and exterior are all sewn together. Here's my top stitching along here. You just want to go and make sure that the interior is sitting all the way down in there. You can just roll it around and push it down. Okay, and then I'm going to fold back that cuff that I wanted to make. Now this basket is also reversible, although for me it wouldn't be reversible because when I pull down the cuff my dogs would be upside down. But if you're not using a directional fabric and you want to make a reversible basket, you certainly can do that. And there you go. Your little round basket is all complete. I hope that you've enjoyed watching this video. Please like and subscribe. And I do give a very sincere thank you to all of you who have already subscribed and supported my channel.